The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Many people have heard the phrase, "the Bronx is burning," and know it was something discussed on TV as the blimp camera looked out over the Bronx during the 1977 World Series. But unless they lived through it in the 70s, many don't know why the Bronx was burning, who was burning it, or even what the South Bronx was like before or after it was burning. There's a film called Decade of Fire by a Bronx woman who was there, who lived through it, and that film has a major showing coming up the evening of Thursday, March 14th, later this week, at Hostos Community College. Decade of Fire. It documents this memorable slice of Bronx history that had impact then and also has implications for today. Please join me in welcoming the filmmaker of Decade of Fire, which is a vital document of Bronx history. It is Vivian Vasquez. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
And also a housing rights activist and a leader of CASA, Community Action for Safe Apartments, CASA. It is Carmen Vega Rivera. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
Let's start with you, Ms. Vasquez. Just talk about why you made the film. I might have already touched on why you made it because nobody knows what this was. But give me from your perspective why you went through this incredible process to put it together.
So I worked for a nonprofit organization that was starting up a high school back in the early 2000s. And at that time, we wanted to teach a curriculum of Bronx history to the high school students. The curriculum that was written by myself and mostly by Julia Allen, one of our co-producers in the project, was considered a little bit too radical. It was one-sided, and so we were never able to teach the curriculum. However, Julia and I kept talking about my experiences in the South Bronx.
And both of you had lived through it.
Julia had not lived through it. And so she had a lot of curious questions about that upbringing or that experience. And so, she began to document. She encouraged me to document my story. And, things like, sometimes we slept with our shoes on, or sometimes, we just had to run out of the building in the middle of the night, or
because there was a fire going on.
Because there was a fire, or, that there were fires all the time, like still remembering the smell, unknowing that fires occurred every day. And so we decided to put the thoughts and the experiences on paper. And then eventually the idea was to put some film together. And she introduced me to Gretchen Hildebrand, who is a filmmaker. And then we began to conduct research, talk to community activists, community members, all kinds of folks, look at archival footage, and we began to understand that the fires was a function of institutional racism, of neglect, of policies, discriminatory policies that really devastated the South Bronx, and I needed to put that out there. And I also wanted to share that it wasn't the people, realizing that it wasn't the people who burned the South Bronx, but that there were these forces at play.
We're definitely going to talk about that. The dynamic that you just related between you and Ms. Allen are exactly what I talked about, is that everybody, the Bronx is burning, they know Howard Cosell had something to do with that, and actually we do have the clip, we're going to maybe show a piece of that as well. But that is part of what makes this so compelling is that, wait a minute, the Bronx is burning. Okay, the Bronx is burning, the Bronx is burning. But now we understand a little bit more about what really did happen where we had never done it. And the person you're talking about, Ms. Allen, she also was coming from the outside, like so many others. People born, since 2000 have heard about it, but they have no idea about it. Let's get some of the particulars. How long did it take to shoot? How did you get the funding for it? And all those kinds of things.
So it took us about 10 years to complete the film, from start to finish. We started very modestly. We began to talk to community people, folks that I grew up with. I am a member of 52 People for Progress. And so we began to have dinners, just filming conversations. We began to conduct research. We initiated a Kickstarter campaign in 2011. We got some funding for that, and we started shooting. Then we didn't have any money for a while, but we were all full-time employees doing something else, so we worked on weekends. Eventually, we received some money through the New York State Department of Cultural Affairs, and little by little, what put us over was we received funding from the Ford Foundation and then eventually from ITVS, which allowed us to finish.
You were just compelled to tell this story. You said this is in your mind. I mean, to go through all of what you went through, and there are many artists who do, a lot of stuff like that. But to go through what you went through, because you just had to, somebody had to hear what happened. This was too incredible to keep to yourself, right? Okay. Wanted to establish that.
Yeah.
I think for me, as somebody who lived in the Bronx during the time, did not live in the South Bronx, it was quite an education. Ms. Vega Rivera, you came to the Bronx toward the end of this decade. What did you find? And then, as somebody who'd been committed to housing rights and that kind of activism all along, what was your reaction to what you had seen?
Well, prior to coming to the Bronx at the end of the decade is that I visited the Bronx quite often because I have relatives who lived in St. Anne's, Brook Avenue, and other parts of the Bronx. So we were always traveling from the Lower East Side to the Bronx and seeing the devastation happening and seeing family members being displaced, buildings being sealed up. And then we started to notice that what was happening in the Bronx was happening in the Lower East Side. And I happened to live there and experienced it. And like Vivian, had to make sure that I was ready to leave whenever a fire was about to happen because you just didn't know. When I came to the Bronx in '79 to work as one of the curators of the Bronx Museum of the Arts, I remember very distinctly November 2nd of 1979, and it was the opening of an exhibition of photographs called Devastation Resurrection. And that hit me to the core because the image in the catalog and the main image of the exhibition that appealed to everyone was in this rubble of debris and devastation was this one flower blooming, that in fact there was life and beauty within the Bronx.
Still there.
And it's still there. And that hit to the core that if it's still there, then I'm going to go find it. And I went looking and seeking artists that were born and raised or moved into the South Bronx and were literally doing work reflecting the beauty of what was within our community.
Among the many aspects of the film that come out is this idea that, okay, so this happened. We know it happened. We're going to document a little further what Ms. Vasquez said about who actually did it. But then there was real energy to say, we are going to rebuild it. We're just not going to let our homes be like this. Talk to me a little bit about that energy and even how it plays out today.
So most definitely, we took action. So even though it was happening, it didn't take away our spirit. It didn't take away our values and our beliefs. We kept building the Bronx. The Bronx that we see today, that everybody's taking credit for, is the Bronx that we built after the fires, while the fires were going on. We opened up small businesses. We had new immigrants coming. We taught our kids. We took them around. We showed them. We tried to get them programming. When there weren't any services and programming, we created it, whether it was in the streets. Various nonprofits that basically did housing and housing rights were, being birthed. We're talking about Benalla Kelly and Nos Quedamos and Desperados. There was
Bronx.
so many that were
This
there.
all came out after that. We've got videos to show and all that kind of thing. This notion that a child has to sleep in her shoes, or that you might have to get up in the middle of the night. This is a conditional thing that changes how a person thinks. This is not just, well, we once in my home had a fire or had a problem. This becomes a way of life and challenges a child's ability to get up and walk to school every day, because you know what I mean? This is not just one incident that can be traumatic for a child. This creates how you think and live. Am I hitting on to something that became a problem for a community?
I mean, growing up, it instilled fear and insecurity.
That's the point.
And, and we were still kids, so we had to, project toughness on top of all of that. So not only are we afraid, and not only are we like, oh my God, what's going to happen to my family? And, we're not being treated right in these situations, and our homes look like, like they're bombed out, but we have to pretend like everything's okay. But on the other hand, we took care of each other.
Exactly.
There was a major, huge sense of community. We knew all our neighbors. I can walk to my neighbor's house barefooted and ask for sugar, ask for food, vice versa. The kids, anybody could come into my apartment and do the same thing. We had a softball league. We danced.
So in an ironic way, some of that brought people together.
Yes.
Sure.
Okay. Let's show the trailer. There are so many other questions, and we're going to, as soon as we come out of the trailer, we're going to talk about who burnt the Bronx down and why it was burnt down. It comes out certainly in the full film. You'll get a sense of it in the trailer. So if you haven't seen it, we did roll it once before. I have seen the full film at a preview that was in the fall, but it's going to be Thursday night at Hostos Community College. You are required to be there. I don't know how else to tell you. Here it is, Decade of Fire.
We grew up in rubble. We grew up with burnt out decay all over us. The South Bronx was burning down around us, and nobody seemed to know why. This is a story of what happened to my neighborhood.
Everything south of the Cross Bronx Expressway, they just let it burn, and nobody gave a damn.
Fear was everywhere, and everybody was just trying to stay quiet about what was happening.
You see streets where it was teeming with people to become a ghost town.
We had come here from the South and from Puerto Rico, searching for the American dream. Our families lived side by side in the most integrated neighborhoods in the country. But after the fires, it would all be gone. How could city government allow this to happen? Who was in charge? Why?
The South Bronx used to be a respectable Jewish neighborhood. It hasn't been bombed, it's been devastated by neglect, and the people who live here, mostly immigrants from the Deep South or Puerto Rico.
But we didn't burn the Bronx. We were the ones who stayed.
want to leave. We didn't want to go, but we didn't know how. Sometimes you need somebody to just start it.
I said, no, wait a minute. I have to make my move right now.
I made a commitment then, in December 1974, that I was going to put this building back together.
The reason we're trying to do all these things is to show an example to the rest of the people in the neighborhood that if you just try, you could make a lot better neighborhood.
This was just a taste of things to come.
But we need more money, Carter, because I think
the federal government can come in and wave a wand and do this.
Push! Why don't you push?
This story is not just about the Bronx. There are places like this in every major city in America. Places that everyone has given up on, except for us. We came from this so-called terrible place, the South Bronx. But we would never leave it behind.
All right, I would give a standing ovation if I was in a position to do so. Congratulations on the trailer and, of course, on the film. You know, judging from the reaction of the young people who work on the program and looking at that, there is something incredibly compelling about it, and it's part of what I said at the outset. Some people lived through it, and some people are like, wait a minute, what actually happened? Who burnt the Bronx down?
Well, I mean, I can't tell you who burnt the Bronx down specifically. It was left to burn. There was a lot of neglect and abandonment, so that, you know, there was a time in the 50s and the 60s where the buildings were very old, right? And because the South Bronx had been redlined, right, by first banks and then sanctioned by government, right? There was, it was impossible to get any kind of loan or financing to maintain, to improve, to renovate these apartment buildings.
And the reason they did that because they wanted to rebuild and put something else there that they benefited from. And they, I'm going to move it forward.
Yeah.
And they made assumptions about the people who lived there because they didn't care about them as people. That you had started out talking about racism.
Right.
That's what the assertion is.
Right. I mean, we found
People of
documentation that clearly says that if there is one family that is of Puerto Rican or black ancestry, that then that block gets redlined and there are no resources to go into, no loans, no support, no financing could be available to that block. And then that notion grew. Those practices, those racist discriminatory practices grew to not just cover the South Bronx, but places all over the city, especially where people of color live.
And, you know, the one moment in there, and it's expanded on if you see the full film, and I hope you will go on Thursday to Hostos Community College and see it. That headline that said the fire companies, the budget cut fire companies, they literally knew it was burning and then cut fire companies.
Exactly.
Correct. Correct.
It's just a remarkable thing.
Correct.
So that that even if you wanted to go put the fires out, you couldn't do it.
Right. I mean, they created these models and they created these studies that put forth that the Bronx, the South Bronx, did not need firehouses, which was insane at the time because it was burning at the time. Exactly.
Ms. Vega Rivera, you are a current activist about fighting for Bronx communities. Is this largely what fuels it? Is that because you and others have seen what had happened that you say, you know what? We know that it's out there. We still want to fight for our homes. I mean, does that provide some of that impetus?
Yes, it fuels because, you know, there was the burning of the Bronx. And although Vivian didn't say it, there was a lot of talk about that this was about collecting insurance and making sure that communities were being pushed out. And as I said earlier, from our sense, and why I'm doing this work, it's about we're not being pushed out. We're going to stay and we're going to remain and we're going to build the same community that we've had among ourselves. So the pushing out now may not be happening with fires, but it's happening in other ways. It's happening with gentrification. That's the new burning of the Bronx. It is happening with rezoning. That is the new burning of the Bronx. Displacement, the word displacement in itself, the definition can be the new burning of the Bronx. So one of the things that we're doing at CASA is really organizing tenants to take action and to shift the power to the tenants. The tenants have the power. We've changed lots of policies in New York City. We created the right to counsel. 35 years, no one could pass RTC. Tenant organizing did that, and it started at CASA. Certificate of no harassment. Tenant organizing did that, where now landlords can no longer repair their apartments or buildings if they are known to have harassment charges against tenants. So there's a lot of power within community. There's a lot of power within tenants. And what we're doing at CASA is telling the tenants and the residents within us, through collective action, we don't have to be displaced.
This is why many people say, and again, largely for younger people who didn't live through this, who say, well, we're the ones who built the Bronx. Well, now you're understanding who those people are, certainly if you see Decade of Fire. I pulled this off of YouTube, and I want to show it because this is actually the clips from the 1977 World Series when Keith Jackson and Howard Cosell were just, doing the baseball game, and then over Yankee Stadium, the camera, the blimp camera widened, and you could see the fires. What I find incredibly interesting was they were just reporting what they saw. They had no idea of the significance of what they were reporting. They simply said, well, you'll see it in just a moment. And I think this, as a living piece of history, really explains what the world was seeing and thought of The Bronx is Burning. So I guess it's WABC TV, which goes back 42 years. But here's Keith Jackson and Howard Cosell doing this World Series between the Yankees and Dodgers.
That is a live picture, and obviously a major fire in a large building in the South Bronx region of New York City. That's a live picture, and obviously the fire department in the Bronx have their problem. My goodness, that's a huge place.
That's the very area where President Carter trod just a few days ago.
With one out now, 2-0.
That's a live shot again of that fire in the South Bronx that Keith called to your attention just a few moments ago. Wonder how many alarms are involved, but as Keith said, the fire department really has its work cut out for it.
Here it is, 6.
News item, Keith. I've just had word that that fire we've shown in the South Bronx, first to pitch, fouled off. That fire in the South Bronx, fortunately, no lives in danger. It's an abandoned apartment building, and the problem is to get the fire out and prevent it from spreading, of course, but at least no lives in danger.
That's good news. 2-2 for the Yankee third baseman. Sharply.
I don't know whether that fire in the South Bronx has subsided or has been mitigated, but still remains in diversified areas of that abandoned apartment building. But we emphasize as a news matter that which we stated earlier. No lives endangered. It was an abandoned apartment building. That's Steve Yeager. Hurt tonight, home run tonight. Well, it looks like that fire is just about out, Keith. Fire department deserves a lot of credit for their prompt action, assuming our surmisal is correct.
An old building like that, particularly a vacant building, can get out of hand pretty quick. But that building was vacant, as we're told. Ken Clay.
Well, there you go. Old buildings, abandoned buildings. So now, from a public relations point of view, this is the way the Bronx was being portrayed. And even other people looking at it would say, well, they're abandoned buildings, so what? You can shed some light on what actually that was.
That was a school. That was an elementary school.
An elementary school.
Right, and it wasn't, this wasn't the only coverage. There was coverage from the BCC and other media outlets that talked about the Bronx is burning, and you have these people from the South and from Puerto Rico in these neighborhoods who are acting like of derelicts, and they don't know how to take care of their apartments. Even the fire commissioner, John Hagan, at that time said that because people were coming from the South, that we didn't know how to take care of apartments, and that's why the Bronx was burning. So that there was this media kind of like portrayal that the people of the South Bronx burned the Bronx, that they didn't know how to take care of their homes, that it was
we
our
burnt
fault.
down our own schools.
It was that we burned down our own homes, which doesn't really make any sense. My family did not come from Puerto Rico to burn their home.
And let's just talk about that. One of the things which does come through the film is the way that people were. You've alluded to it so far on the show. My sense from this and other sources is it was one of the real true melting pots of what, you can characterize the rainbow of New York or whatever you want to call it, that people really, and other people I've spoken to have said, people really did get together and really did live together prior to this whole process. That's accurate.
That's accurate.
So from my experience,
we'll let you each weigh in.
Right.
First, Ms. Vasquez, and then you can.
My personal experience, growing up in my building on Leggett Avenue, our main babysitter and my mother's best friend right above us was Jewish, Ray. The woman next door, Betty, was Irish, right? We had African-American neighbors downstairs. We had a family from Cuba, and then there was us. And then there was Mr. Lee, who on the block around the corner had the dry cleaners. And then you had the Kaufman tax, store. So
it really was the way I just portrayed it. It really was.
Yeah, and so this whole notion of like community, a sense of community, I lived through that, right? In my school, we sang the Star Spangled Banner. We sang La Borinqueña, which is the Puerto Rican national anthem, and we sang Lift Every Voice and Sing. Nowadays, you ask kids, what is Lift Every Voice and Sing? They don't know what that is.
Right.
It's the African-American, national anthem. We sang all three, and we celebrated in our schools all three cultures and more.
And this process broke that up, this decade of fire, because it broke up the communities. And
we lost 80% of our housing stock. So
Wow.
80% of the people who lived in these homes disappeared or moved somewhere else.
Okay. Final word from you. I think we only have a couple of seconds.
Sure.
What's the sum total, and why should people see Decade of Fire?
People really need to understand the history and view the history. I still have people that come to me and ask, where do you live, Carmen? And I go, the Bronx. And
they still think
I
of
still
that,
get the
that
response of, oh. And when I say, oh, are you ill? They go, what? I go, you just said, oh, to the fact that I live in the Bronx. Now I'm getting people making the shift when I say I live in the South Bronx. Oh, that's a cool, hip place, right?
We gotta get going. Listen, Decade of Fire. Please make sure you see it Thursday, folks. If you want to put up the the full page so people can see exactly when and where, it is at Hostos Community College. Vivian Vasquez, thank you so much. Congratulations on a very important piece of Bronx history.
Thank you so much.
And Carmen Vega
Thank you for
Rivera,
having
always
me.
a pleasure to have you.
Likewise.
Folks, if you have further questions or comments on anything you heard on tonight's show or anything going on in the Bronx, then email them to us at bronxtalk@bronxnet.org. You send us a tweet at BronxTalk or post them on our Facebook page. We thank our producer, Helen Greenberg, our directors today, William Guzman, Nick Marrero. Thanks to the cast of thousands who really appreciated what they saw today. Good night.